My wife said, "I sold your old Cadillac for $40,000. Her family celebrated, thinking it was a smart move. "Let's buy dinner with the money," she said. I stayed quiet. Then the car dealership called screaming, "Why is the police here? I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." I stared at my empty garage, the oil stain on the concrete floor, the only evidence that my 1967 Cadillac Eldorado had ever existed. My hands trembled as I gripped the doorframe, trying to process what Melissa had just told me with such casual indifference. "I sold your old Cadillac for $40,000, she announced from behind me, her voice carrying that tone she used when she thought she'd done something particularly clever. "The buyer came this morning while you were at your doctor's appointment." I turned slowly, my 70-year-old joints protesting, and looked at the woman I'd been married to for 38 years. She stood there in our kitchen doorway, arms crossed, wearing that satisfied smirk I'd come to know so well. Behind her, I could see our son Michael and daughter-in-law Jennifer exchanging approving glances. "You sold my car?" The words came out barely above a whisper. I felt like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart with an iron fist. "Oh, Arthur, don't be so dramatic," Melissa waved her hand dismissively. "It was just sitting there collecting dust. When's the last time you even drove that thing? 6 months ago? A year?" Michael stepped forward, putting his hand on my shoulder in that patronizing way that made my skin crawl. "Dad, Mom did you a favor. You're 70 years old. You don't need to be driving around in some ancient gas guzzler. Think about the insurance savings alone." Jennifer nodded enthusiastically, bouncing our 18-month-old grandson Tommy on her hip. "Plus $40,000. That's a small fortune, Grandpa Art. You could buy something practical, maybe a nice sedan with good safety ratings." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell them that they had no idea what they'd done, that the car wasn't just transportation to me, but when I opened my mouth, nothing came out. The words stuck in my throat like they always did when I tried to explain something important to this family. "We're going to have a celebration dinner," Melissa continued, already mentally spending money that belonged to something precious to me. "I'm thinking that new steakhouse downtown, the one with the $40 ribeyes. We deserve a treat after making such a smart financial decision." Smart financial decision. I closed my eyes and leaned against the garage wall. If only they knew. If only any of them had ever bothered to listen when I tried to tell them about cars, about history, about the things that mattered to me. "Dad, you okay?" Michael's voice seemed to come from far away. "You look pale," I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. How could I explain that they just sold a piece of my soul? How could I make them understand that the Cadillac wasn't just a car, but the last tangible connection I had to my father? The worst part was how pleased they all looked with themselves. Melissa was already on her phone, probably making dinner reservations. Jennifer was cooing to Tommy about how Grandpa was going to buy him lots of toys with his car money. Michael was nodding approvingly, like he'd personally overseen some brilliant business transaction. None of them asked me how I felt about it. None of them considered that, maybe, just maybe, I should have been consulted before they disposed of my property. In their minds, I was just a confused old man who needed their guidance to make smart decisions. I walked back into the house and sat heavily in my recliner, the same chair I'd been relegated to for the past 5 years as my family increasingly treated me like furniture. Melissa bustled around the kitchen, talking excitedly about appetizers and wine pairings while Michael and Jennifer discussed how I should invest the money. "A CD would be safest," Jennifer was saying. "With his age, he can't afford to take risks in the stock market. Or maybe we should help him set up one of those high-yield savings accounts," Michael added. "Keep it liquid in case he needs it for medical expenses." They talked about me like I wasn't sitting 10 feet away, like I was already dead and they were dividing up my estate. The money from my car, my father's car, had become their windfall to manage. I thought about the day my father gave me that Cadillac. I was 22, fresh out of college, about to start my first real job. Dad had bought it new in 1967, midnight blue with white leather interior, and he'd babied that car for 15 years before passing it down to me. "Take care of her, Arthur," he'd said, running his weathered hand along the pristine hood. "She's got character, not like these plastic pieces of junk they're making now." I'd driven that car to my first job, to my wedding, to the hospital when each of my children was born. I'd spent countless weekends in the garage with my father, learning how to maintain her, how to appreciate the craftsmanship that went into every detail. Even after Dad passed away 10 years ago, working on that Cadillac felt like spending time with him. But try explaining that to Melissa. Try telling her that some things have value beyond their price tag. I'd learned long ago that my wife viewed everything through the lens of immediate practicality. If something wasn't serving an obvious purpose in her daily life, it was clutter to be eliminated. "Arthur, stop sulking." Melissa's sharp voice cut through my memories. "We're doing something nice with the money, as a family. Isn't that what matters?" I looked up at her, this woman who'd shared my bed for nearly 4 decades but had never really known me at all. "You should have asked me first." She laughed, actually laughed. "Asked you? Honey, we both know you would have said no. You'd have given me 100 reasons why that old car needed to stay in our garage forever, taking up space we could use for something useful. It was useful to me." "Sitting there covered in dust is useful?" Jennifer chimed in. "Grandpa Art, you haven't even started it in months." That wasn't true, but I didn't bother correcting her. I'd started the Cadillac every Sunday morning, just like my father taught me. I'd let her warm up while I checked the fluid levels and tire pressure. Sometimes I'd take her for a short drive around the neighborhood, feeling the smooth power of that 428 cubic inch V8 engine purring beneath the hood. But they never saw those Sunday mornings. They never witnessed my weekly ritual of connection with the past. In their world, if they didn't observe something happening, it simply didn't exist. My phone rang, startling everyone. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something told me to answer. "Is this Arthur Stevenson?" The voice on the other end sounded frantic, almost panicked. "Yes, this is Arthur." "Sir, this is Bill Patterson from Patterson Classic Cars. I need to ask you something very important. Did you sell me a 1967 Cadillac Eldorado today?" My heart started pounding. The room went quiet as my family sensed something was wrong. My wife handled that transaction. "Sir, I need you to listen to me very carefully. The police are here. They're asking questions about this car, and I need to know. Are you absolutely certain you authorized this sale?" The phone slipped from my trembling fingers and clattered to the floor. Melissa's face had gone white as snow. Michael and Jennifer were staring at me with wide, confused eyes. From the dropped phone, I could hear Bill Patterson's voice growing more urgent. "Mr. Stevenson? Mr. Stevenson, are you there? Sir, why are the police asking me about stolen property?" The silence in our living room was deafening after I hung up the phone with Bill Patterson. Melissa stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, her face pale as parchment. Michael and Jennifer exchanged worried glances while baby Tommy gurgled obliviously in his high chair. "What did he mean about stolen property?" Melissa's voice cracked, the confident tone from earlier completely gone. I picked up the phone from where it had fallen and set it carefully on the side table. My hands were steadier now, steadier than they'd been in years. Something about hearing that panic in Bill Patterson's voice had awakened something in me that had been sleeping for far too long. "Arthur, answer me." Melissa stepped closer, her eyes darting between me and the phone. "What's going on?" I looked at her for a long moment. This woman who'd just sold away 15 years of memories without a second thought. How do you explain to someone who's never valued anything beyond its immediate utility that some possessions carry the weight of entire lifetimes? "That car," I said quietly, "wasn't just any 1967 Eldorado." "What do you mean?" Michael asked, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. I closed my eyes and let myself drift back to 1992, 13 years after I'd inherited the Cadillac from my father. I was 45 then, still young enough to crawl under cars without my back screaming in protest, still naive enough to believe that sharing my passions with my family would bring us closer together. I'd been in the garage that Saturday morning, replacing the carburetor gaskets, when I found the envelope tucked behind the glove compartment. My name was written on it in my father's careful handwriting. "For Arthur, when you're ready to understand." Inside were papers I'd never seen before, documentation from the Cadillac factory in Detroit, letters from engineers. Most importantly, a certificate of authenticity that made my hands shake as I read it. My father's 1967 Eldorado wasn't just any Eldorado. It was one of only 12 ever built with a special high-performance engine package that Cadillac had developed but never officially released. The package had been a secret project, assembled by hand for a select group of Cadillac executives and automotive journalists. Each car was essentially a prototype, worth exponentially more than a standard Eldorado. But my father had never told me. He'd kept that secret right up until his death, leaving me to discover it years later, when I was mature enough to handle the responsibility that came with such knowledge. Dad? Michael's voice pulled me back to the present. You're scaring us. What's so special about the car? I opened my eyes and looked at my son, this 42-year-old man who'd never shown the slightest interest in anything I cared about. How many times had I tried to share my knowledge of cars with him? How many Saturday mornings had I invited him to the garage only to be told he had more important things to do? Your grandfather, I began, my voice growing stronger with each word, was more than just a mechanic. He was what they called a car whisperer back in his day. Cadillac consulted with him on special projects. Jennifer scoffed. Grandpa was a mechanic at a local garage. I remember you telling us that. He was, but he was also one of the most respected engine specialists on the East Coast. Cadillac flew him to Detroit 6 times in 1967 to work on a secret project. Melissa's eyes narrowed. You never mentioned any of this before. I tried to. For years, I tried to tell you about the car's history, about what made it special. But every time I brought it up, you'd change the subject or tell me I was boring everyone with my car stories. The room fell quiet except for Tommy babbling to himself. I could see the doubt in their faces, the assumption that I was making this up to justify my attachment to an old car. The engine in that Cadillac, I continued, wasn't the standard 428. It was a modified version that produced 60 more horsepower than anything Cadillac officially sold that year. Only 12 cars were ever built with that engine. How do you know all this? Michael asked, his skepticism evident. I smiled for the first time all day. Because I've spent the last 30 years researching it. Because I've been in contact with the other owners. Because 3 years ago, a collector in California offered me $250,000 for that car and I turned him down. The number hit the room like a physical blow. Melissa actually staggered backward, gripping the door frame for support. $250,000? She whispered. The last one that sold at auction went for $320,000. That was 18 months ago. I stood up slowly, my old bones creaking, and walked toward the garage door. But it wasn't about the money. It never was. I opened the door and stepped into the empty garage, breathing in the lingering scent of motor oil and memories. Behind me, I could hear my family following, their footsteps hesitant on the concrete floor. This is where I spent every Sunday morning for the past 10 years, I said, running my hand along the workbench where my tools still lay organized exactly as I'd left them. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to, because maintaining that car was like maintaining a connection to my father. I pulled open a drawer in the workbench and withdrew a thick folder, its edges worn from years of handling. Inside were photographs, documents, correspondence with other collectors, and detailed maintenance records going back 40 years. He kept everything, I said, showing them pictures of my father working on the Cadillac's engine alongside men in Cadillac engineering uniforms. Every oil change, every repair, every modification. He documented it all because he knew someday it would matter. Jennifer picked up one of the photographs, squinting at the date stamp, October 1967. This is really Grandpa? That's him, working with the Cadillac team on the final engine adjustments before delivery. I pointed to a younger version of my father, his sleeves rolled up, his face intense with concentration. He was proud of that work, but he never bragged about it. He wasn't that kind of man. Melissa was frantically flipping through the documentation, her face growing paler with each page. Arthur, why didn't you ever show me these papers? I turned to face her, and for the first time in years, I didn't try to soften my words. Because you never asked. Because every time I tried to talk about the car, you made it clear that you thought it was a waste of time. Because you treated my interests like they were foolish hobbies that didn't matter. The truth hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire that had been smoldering for decades. I could see the exact moment when Melissa realized what she'd done, when the magnitude of her mistake finally penetrated her consciousness. But it's just a car, she said weakly, though her voice lacked any conviction. No, I said firmly, it's history, it's craftsmanship. It's the last thing my father and I worked on together before he got too sick to come to the garage. I closed the folder and held it against my chest. It's everything you never bothered to understand about me. My phone rang again. Bill Patterson's number. This time when I answered, his voice was calmer but urgent. Mr. Stevenson, I need you to come down here immediately. The police want to speak with you about the ownership documentation for this vehicle. There are some irregularities they need to discuss. I looked at Melissa, whose face had gone from pale to gray. What kind of irregularities? Sir, did you personally sign the title transfer? Because the signature on this paperwork doesn't match the signature on your driver's license. The phone slipped from my hand again, but this time I let it fall. Behind me I could hear Melissa's sharp intake of breath, the sound of someone who had just realized that her clever plan had crossed a line she never intended to cross. For the first time in 38 years of marriage, I truly saw my wife clearly. And what I saw was a stranger who had been living in my house, making decisions about my life, treating me like an obstacle to be managed rather than a partner to be respected. The police were coming, and everything was about to change. The drive to Patterson Classic Cars felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. Melissa sat rigid in the passenger seat, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. She hadn't spoken a word since we left the house, but I could practically hear her mind racing, trying to figure out how to talk her way out of the mess she'd created. Michael had insisted on following us in his own car, bringing Jennifer and the baby. I'd told them it wasn't necessary, but my son had developed this habit over the years of treating me like I couldn't handle important situations on my own. Today, for the first time, I was grateful for his interference. I had a feeling I was going to need witnesses for whatever was about to unfold. Patterson Classic Cars sat on the outskirts of town, a sprawling lot filled with pristine vintage automobiles that gleamed under the afternoon sun. I'd driven past this place countless times over the years, always slowing down to admire the inventory, but I'd never had reason to stop. Bill Patterson had a reputation for dealing only in the most exceptional classic cars, the kind that serious collectors fought over at auctions. As we pulled into the parking lot, I could see my Cadillac immediately. She sat apart from the other vehicles, surrounded by 3 police cars and a small crowd of people in suits. Even from a distance, she looked magnificent, her midnight blue paint catching the light like liquid metal, her chrome bumpers gleaming like mirrors. For a moment, my heart swelled with pride at how beautiful she still was after all these years. Then I saw the tension on the faces of the people gathered around her, and reality crashed back down on me. Bill Patterson approached our car before we'd even finished parking. He was a tall, thin man in his 60s with graying hair and worried eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His usual confident demeanor, the kind you'd expect from someone who dealt in 6-figure automobiles, had been replaced by barely controlled panic. "Mr. Stevenson," he said as I stepped out of the car, "thank you for coming so quickly. I'm afraid we have a very serious situation here." Detective Maria Santos introduced herself with a firm handshake and direct eye contact that made me feel like she could see straight through to my soul. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with sharp features and an intensity that suggested she didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Mr. Stevenson, I need to ask you some direct questions about the sale of this vehicle. Did you personally authorize your wife to sell this car?" I glanced at Melissa, who was standing behind me like she was trying to make herself invisible. "No, I did not." "Were you aware that she was planning to sell it?" "No, I found out about the sale after it had already happened." Detective Santos nodded, making notes in a small notebook. "Mr. Patterson, would you please explain to Mr. Stevenson what happened when you attempted to register the title transfer?" Bill Patterson ran his hand through his hair nervously. "When I submitted the paperwork to the DMV, they flagged the title immediately. The signature didn't match your signature on file, and when they ran the VIN number through their database, it came back with some unusual classifications." "What kind of classifications?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Mr. Stevenson," Detective Santos said, "this vehicle is registered with the National Historic Vehicle Registry as a significant automotive artifact. Cars with this designation require special documentation for any ownership transfers. The DMV is required to verify that sales are legitimate and that the vehicles aren't being stolen or sold under false pretenses." I felt a surge of vindication mixed with sadness. My father had registered the car with the Historic Registry in 1985, ensuring that its significance would be preserved for future generations. It was one of the many things he'd done to protect the Cadillac's legacy, one of the many things I'd tried to explain to my family over the years. "Furthermore," the detective continued, "our investigation revealed that this particular vehicle has been the subject of numerous inquiries from collectors and museums over the past decade. Its estimated value is significantly higher than the sale price your wife negotiated." Melissa finally found her voice. "I didn't know about any of that. Arthur never told me the car was worth so much money." I turned to look at her, and the anger that had been building inside me for hours finally broke free. "I tried to tell you, Melissa. For 10 years I tried to share this with you. Every time I mentioned the car's history, you rolled your eyes and changed the subject. You made it clear that you thought my interests were stupid and boring. That's not true, she protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my photos until I found what I was looking for. Here's a picture I took 3 months ago of a letter I received from the Peterson Automotive Museum in Los Angeles. They wanted to feature the Cadillac in a special exhibit about prototype vehicles. I showed you this letter and you know what you said? Melissa's face flushed red. She remembered. You said, "That's nice, honey," and went back to watching your television show. You didn't even look at the letter. You never look at anything that matters to me. Michael stepped forward, his face pale with dawning realization. Dad, are you saying this car is worth more than $40,000? Detective Santos answered before I could. Mr. Stevenson, based on recent auction results for similar vehicles, your car's estimated value is between $250,000 and $400,000. The number hit my family like a physical blow. Jennifer actually gasped out loud. Michael stumbled backward and had to lean against his car for support. Melissa looked like she was going to faint. $400,000, Michael whispered. The last comparable vehicle sold at Barrett Jackson for $375,000, Bill Patterson added. And that one wasn't in nearly as pristine condition as your father's car. I watched my family absorb this information, saw the exact moment when they realized the magnitude of what had been lost. But what struck me most wasn't their shock at the money. It was their shock that I had known something they didn't. For the first time in years, they were looking at me like I might actually have valuable knowledge worth listening to. Mr. Stevenson, Detective Santos said, I need to ask your wife some questions about how she obtained access to the title and registration documents. Melissa's hand started shaking. Arthur keeps all the car papers in his desk drawer. I just took them when I needed them. Did you attempt to forge his signature on the title transfer? I thought. Melissa's voice trailed off as she realized there was no good way to answer that question. Ma'am, I need a yes or no answer. Did you sign your husband's name to legal documents without his permission? Melissa looked around desperately, as if searching for someone to rescue her from the consequences of her actions. Her eyes landed on me, pleading and panicked. For 38 years I had been her safety net. Every time she made a mistake, every time she acted impulsively, every time she needed someone to clean up her messes, I had been there. I had smoothed things over, made excuses, covered for her poor judgment. But standing there in that parking lot, looking at my beautiful Cadillac surrounded by police cars, something fundamental shifted inside me. I wasn't going to save her this time. I wasn't going to pretend that what she'd done was acceptable just to keep peace in the family. Yes, Melissa whispered finally. I signed his name. Detective Santos closed her notebook with a sharp snap. Mrs. Stevenson, I'm afraid I need to inform you that you may be facing charges of forgery and theft. You'll need to come with me to the station to answer some additional questions. As I watched my wife of 38 years being led toward a police car, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. The satisfaction of truth finally being acknowledged. For years I had been dismissed, ignored, treated like my thoughts and feelings didn't matter. Now suddenly, everyone was paying attention. Bill Patterson approached me as the police cars pulled away. Mr. Stevenson, I want you to know that the sale is obviously void. Your car will remain in my possession until this legal matter is resolved, but she's safe here. I nodded, looking at the Cadillac one more time. Tomorrow I would have her back where she belonged, but more importantly, I would have something back that I'd lost long ago, my family's respect. Whether I wanted it anymore was an entirely different question. The house felt different when I returned home alone that evening. Melissa was still at the police station, and Michael had taken Jennifer and the baby back to their place, promising to call me later after he'd processed everything. I walked through rooms that had been filled with voices and activity just hours earlier, and the silence was both unsettling and strangely peaceful. I made myself a simple dinner, scrambled eggs and toast, the kind of meal Melissa always criticized as bachelor food, and sat at the kitchen table with the folder of documents about the Cadillac spread out before me. For the first time in years, I could look at these papers without having to explain or justify their importance to anyone. The phone rang at 8:30. Michael's name appeared on the caller ID. Dad, how are you holding up? I'm fine, son. And surprisingly, I was. How's your mother? She's pretty shaken up. The police released her a few hours ago, but she has to appear in court next week. Michael paused, and I could hear him taking a deep breath. Dad, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. All right. Did you really try to tell us about the car? About how valuable it was? I leaned back in my chair, thinking about all the conversations we'd never really had. All the times I'd started to share something important only to be dismissed or ignored. Michael, 3 years ago at Christmas, I brought down a book about prototype Cadillacs. I spent 20 minutes showing you pictures of cars just like mine, explaining about the special engines, the limited production numbers. Do you remember what you said? Silence on the other end of the line. You said, "That's interesting, Dad," and then you immediately started talking about your promotion at work. You've always done that, son. All of you have. Whenever I try to share something that matters to me, you find a way to redirect the conversation to something you think is more important. I remember that Christmas. I thought you were just showing me old car pictures. They weren't just old car pictures. They were documentation of automotive history, evidence of why my car was special. I pulled out one of the articles from the folder, a piece from Hemmings Motor News that featured a 2-page spread about prototype Eldorados. I've tried to share this passion with you and your sister for decades, but none of you ever wanted to listen. Michael was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice sounded different, smaller somehow. Dad, I'm starting to realize that maybe we haven't been very good at listening to you about a lot of things. That admission hung between us like a bridge neither of us was quite ready to cross. I wanted to tell him that it was okay, that we could start over, that families make mistakes and learn from them, but the words wouldn't come. The hurt was too deep, had been building for too many years. Your mother took those papers from my desk without asking, I said instead. She forged my signature on legal documents. She sold something that belonged to me without my knowledge or consent. Those aren't mistakes, Michael. Those are choices. I know. But Dad, she's family. We have to figure out how to work through this. Family. The word that had been used to justify so many years of dismissal and disrespect. The excuse that was supposed to make everything acceptable because we shared the same last name. Michael, can I ask you something? When was the last time you called me just to talk? Not because you needed something, not because your mother told you to check on me, but just because you wanted to hear my voice. The silence stretched so long I thought he might have hung up. I don't remember, he admitted finally. When was the last time you asked about my hobbies, my interests, my thoughts about anything that mattered to me? Dad, please don't. When was the last time any of you treated me like I was a person worth knowing instead of just an old man who needed to be managed and protected from his own decisions? I heard Michael's sharp intake of breath. That's not fair, isn't it? I stood up and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the empty driveway where the Cadillac should have been parked. For 5 years, you've all been making decisions for me. What I should drive, where I should live, how I should spend my money, what hobbies are appropriate for someone my age. You've treated me like I'm incompetent, like my 70 years of life experience count for nothing. We were trying to help. No, Michael, you were trying to control. There's a difference. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. I was in my workshop area of the garage, organizing tools and trying to restore some sense of normalcy to my routine, when I heard cars pulling into the driveway. Through the window, I could see 2 vehicles I didn't recognize, a silver BMW and a red pickup truck. The doorbell rang, and I opened it to find 3 people I'd never met before. An elderly man with a carefully groomed beard, a middle-aged woman with intelligent eyes, and a younger man who looked like he might be a mechanic, based on his work clothes. Mr. Stevenson, the older man asked. I'm Robert Chen. I understand you own a 1967 Eldorado prototype. I'm sorry, how did you... Word travels fast in the collector car community, the woman said, extending her hand. I'm Dr. Sarah Martinez from the Automotive Heritage Foundation. This is Tommy Ricci, one of the finest restoration specialists on the East Coast. Robert Chen smiled apologetically. Mr. Stevenson, I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but when we heard that your car had surfaced for sale, we had to reach out. I've been searching for one of these prototypes for 15 years. Searching for one? I own 2 of the other 11, he explained. I've been trying to document the history of all 12 cars for a book I'm writing about Cadillac's secret projects. Your car is the most complete example we've found. Dr. Martinez pulled out a tablet and showed me photographs of beautifully restored classic cars in museum settings. Mr. Stevenson, the Automotive Heritage Foundation preserves significant vehicles for future generations. We'd love to discuss the possibility of featuring your car in our permanent collection. I invited them in, still processing the fact that strangers knew more about my car's current situation than my own family had known about its historical significance. As we sat in my living room, they told me stories about the other prototype owners, about the network of enthusiasts who'd been tracking these rare vehicles for decades. Your father, Robert Chen said, consulting notes on his phone, corresponded with my friend Harold Weinstein back in the 1980s. Harold owns car number 7. They exchanged detailed maintenance records and photographs. He showed me copies of letters written in my father's careful handwriting, discussing technical details about the special engines, sharing information about parts availability and restoration techniques. It was like discovering a whole side of my father's life that I'd never known existed. He was quite respected in our community, Dr. Martinez added. His documentation of the prototype specifications was instrumental in helping us understand the engineering differences between these cars and the standard production models. Tommy Ricci leaned forward, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. Mr. Stevenson, I've been working on classic Cadillacs for 30 years, and I've never seen one maintained as meticulously as yours. The engine compartment is absolutely pristine. Every component is either original or correctly restored using period-appropriate techniques. I felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with money or prestige. These people understood what I'd been trying to explain to my family for years, that the Cadillac represented something larger than just transportation. It was a piece of automotive history, a testament to craftsmanship, a link to a time when cars were built by hand with attention to every detail. Mr. Stevenson, Robert Chen said carefully, I hope you don't mind me asking, but we heard through the collector network that your car was almost sold yesterday. Is everything all right? I found myself telling them the whole story, about Melissa's sale, about the police involvement, about my family's complete lack of understanding about what they'd almost lost. These strangers listened with the kind of attention my own family had never shown, asking thoughtful questions and expressing genuine shock at how close the car had come to disappearing into the wrong hands. The dealer who bought it, Tommy Ricci said, shaking his head, he had no idea what he was getting. If he'd tried to modify it or sell it to someone who didn't understand its significance, it would have been a tragedy, Dr. Martinez finished. These cars are irreplaceable pieces of automotive history. When they left an hour later, each of them pressed business cards into my hand and made me promise to call if I ever wanted to connect with other collectors or needed advice about the car's care. For the first time in years, I felt like I'd had a conversation with people who saw me as knowledgeable and interesting, rather than just an old man with outdated interests. As I watched their cars disappear down the street, I realized something that should have been obvious long ago. I had been living with the wrong people. For decades, I'd tried to force my family to appreciate things they would never understand, while there was an entire community of people out there who shared my passions and respected my expertise. That evening, Melissa came home from her sister's house where she'd been staying since her release from the police station. She looked exhausted and defeated, her usual confident demeanor replaced by something I'd rarely seen in her: uncertainty. Arthur, she said quietly, we need to talk. I looked up from the collector car magazine I'd been reading, one that Robert Chen had left for me, with an article about prototype vehicles that included a mention of my father's documentation work. All right, I said, let's talk. Melissa sat across from me at our kitchen table, the same table where she'd announced the sale of my Cadillac just 2 days earlier. Her hands were folded in her lap, and for the first time in our 38-year marriage, she looked genuinely unsure of herself. I know you're angry, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I know I made a terrible mistake. I set down the collector magazine and studied her face. The woman who had always been so certain of her decisions, so quick to dismiss my concerns, now looked small and vulnerable. Part of me, the part that had spent decades trying to keep peace in our household, wanted to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be all right. But I couldn't. Not this time. A mistake, I repeated slowly. Is that what you call forging my signature? Taking my property without permission? Selling something that meant everything to me? Her eyes filled with tears. I didn't know it meant everything to you. You never said. I said it every day for 10 years. The words came out harder than I'd intended, but I didn't soften them. Every time I worked on that car, every time I talked about its history, Every time I tried to share what it represented to me, you chose not to listen. Melissa wiped her eyes with a tissue. I thought it was just a hobby, something to keep you busy in retirement. No, Melissa, you thought it was an inconvenience. You thought my interests were silly and my knowledge was worthless. I leaned forward, meeting her gaze directly. And you weren't the only one. Before she could respond, the doorbell rang. Through the front window, I could see Michael's car in the driveway, along with another vehicle I didn't recognize. When I opened the door, I found Michael standing beside a well-dressed woman with a briefcase. "Dad," Michael said, his voice tense. "This is Patricia Holloway, Mom's attorney. We need to discuss the legal situation." Patricia Holloway was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who radiated the kind of confidence that came from years of getting people out of difficult situations. She shook my hand firmly and asked if we could sit down to talk. "Mr. Stevenson," she said once we were all seated in the living room, "your wife has shared with me the circumstances surrounding the sale of your vehicle. I understand there's been a misunderstanding about ownership and authorization." "There's been no misunderstanding," I said calmly. "My wife stole my car and forged my signature to sell it." "Those are facts, not misunderstandings." Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly. "Mr. Stevenson, I think we can resolve this matter without involving the criminal justice system. Your wife made an error in judgment, but her intentions weren't malicious. She genuinely believed she was helping by liquidating an asset that seemed to be sitting unused." I almost laughed at the careful legal language she was using to describe theft and forgery. "Miss Holloway, do you know how much that car is worth?" "I understand it's more valuable than initially thought, yes. Between $250,000 and $400,000. My wife liquidated an asset worth more than our house without bothering to find out what it was actually worth." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Dad, we all made assumptions. We should have asked more questions. You should have listened to the answers I'd been giving you for years." Patricia opened her briefcase and pulled out several documents. "Mr. Stevenson, I've prepared some paperwork that could help resolve this situation amicably. If you're willing to sign a statement indicating that this was a family misunderstanding rather than intentional theft, the prosecutor might be willing to drop the charges against your wife." I looked at the papers she was holding, then at Melissa's hopeful face, then at Michael's anxious expression. They were asking me to lie, to pretend that years of dismissal and disrespect had been just a misunderstanding, to protect Melissa from the consequences of her actions by taking responsibility for her choices. "No," I said quietly. Patricia blinked. "Excuse me?" "No, I won't sign those papers. I won't lie to protect someone who showed me such complete disrespect." "Arthur, please," Melissa said, fresh tears starting to flow. "I'm your wife. We can work through this." "Are we?" I asked. "Are we really going to work through this? Or are you going to go back to ignoring everything I say the moment this crisis passes?" The room fell silent. Patricia glanced between Melissa and me, clearly recognizing that this was about much more than a car sale gone wrong. "Mr. Stevenson," she said carefully, "what would it take for you to consider resolving this matter privately?" I thought about Robert Chen and Dr. Martinez and Tommy Ricci, people who had spent an hour in my home and shown more interest in my knowledge and expertise than my own family had shown in years. I thought about the community of collectors who had been tracking my car for decades, who understood its significance in ways my family never would. I want my car back, obviously. I want acknowledgement that what was done to me was wrong, not just a misunderstanding. And I want assurance that nothing like this will ever happen again. "Of course," Melissa said quickly. "Arthur, I promise I'm not finished." I turned to Michael. "I also want honesty about something else, something I discovered yesterday." Michael's face went pale. "What do you mean?" I walked to the kitchen and returned with a small wooden box that I'd found while looking through my workshop the previous evening. Inside were receipts, warranties, and documentation for various tools and equipment that had disappeared from my garage over the past 5 years. My 1947 Stanley plane, the one that belonged to my grandfather. "Where is it?" Michael's mouth opened, but no words came out. "My complete set of snap-on wrenches. The ones I bought in 1973 with my first paycheck from the electric company. Where are they?" "Dad, I can explain. The antique tool chest that my father built by hand in 1958. I noticed it missing last month." "Where is it, Michael?" Melissa's face had gone completely white. She knew. Of course she knew. "We needed money for Jennifer's medical bills when Tommy was born," Michael said miserably. Mom suggested that you had a lot of old tools that you weren't using anymore, and there's this antique dealer who you've been stealing from me for years." The words came out flat, emotionless. I was beyond anger now, in that strange, calm place that exists on the other side of betrayal. "Both of you." Patricia Holloway cleared her throat uncomfortably. "Mr. Stevenson, perhaps we should focus on the current legal matter." "No," I said firmly. "This is exactly what we should be focusing on. This pattern of taking my possessions without permission, of treating me like my property belongs to the family to dispose of as they see fit." I pulled out my phone and showed them the photos I'd taken the day before while Robert Chen and his colleagues were visiting. Pictures of empty spaces in my workshop where tools should have been. Pictures of the documentation I'd kept of every item. I've been documenting this for months, wondering if I was losing my memory or if things were actually disappearing. Now I know. Michael buried his face in his hands. "Dad, we always planned to tell you. We were going to replace everything once Jennifer got back to work." "With what money? You sold tools worth thousands of dollars to pay for medical bills, then planned to replace them with inferior modern versions from the hardware store?" "We didn't know they were valuable," Melissa said desperately. "Because you never asked. Because you assumed that anything old was worthless, that anything I cared about was expendable." I looked at each of them in turn. How many other things have disappeared that I haven't noticed yet? The silence that followed was answer enough. Patricia Holloway stood up, her professional composure finally cracking. "Mr. Stevenson, I think I need to advise my client that this conversation should end here. Given the scope of what's being discussed, Mrs. Stevenson may need different legal representation." "That's probably wise," I agreed, "because this isn't just about one car anymore." After Patricia and Michael left, Melissa and I sat alone in our living room for the first time since this whole situation began. The house felt different now, charged with truths that had been hidden for too long. "Arthur," she said finally, "what do you want from me? What do I need to do to fix this?" I looked at this woman I'd shared a life with for nearly 4 decades, and I realized that the question itself revealed how little she understood about what had been broken between us. "I don't think you can fix it, Melissa," I said quietly. "I don't think you even understand what needs to be fixed. Then help me understand." I pulled out the collector car magazine that Robert Chen had left for me and opened it to the article about prototype vehicles. "See this? This article mentions my father's work documenting these cars. It calls him instrumental in preserving automotive history. There are people all over the country who know his name, who respect what he accomplished." Melissa looked at the page, reading slowly. "Yesterday, 3 strangers drove to our house because they wanted to meet the son of the man who helped preserve these cars. They spent an hour asking about my knowledge, my experiences, my insights. They treated me like I had something valuable to offer." I closed the magazine and set it aside. "You've lived with me for 38 years, and you've never once treated me like I had anything valuable to offer. You've never asked about my father's work, never shown interest in my knowledge, never acknowledged that I might know something worth knowing." Melissa's tears were flowing freely now. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Arthur. I didn't realize." "That's the problem, Melissa. You didn't realize because you didn't want to realize. It was easier to dismiss me than to take the time to understand me." The phone rang, interrupting our conversation. It was Detective Santos. "Mr. Stevenson, I wanted to let you know that we've completed our investigation. Your vehicle will be returned to you tomorrow morning. However, I need to inform you that we've uncovered additional irregularities in the paperwork that your wife submitted. We may need to expand our investigation beyond just this single incident." I looked at Melissa's stricken face and made a decision that surprised even me. "Detective Santos, I appreciate your thoroughness, but I think one case is sufficient. My wife understands the seriousness of what she did. I don't think we need to complicate matters further." After I hung up, Melissa stared at me in shock. "Why did you do that?" "You could have." "Because," I said, standing up and walking toward the garage, "I'm not interested in revenge. I'm interested in respect. And respect can't be forced or legislated. It has to be earned." I paused at the garage door and looked back at her one last time. "The question now is whether you think I'm worth the effort of earning it." 3 months later, I stood in my new garage, watching the morning sunlight stream through the windows and illuminate my 1967 Cadillac Eldorado. She looked magnificent in her new home, a modest 2-bedroom house on the outskirts of town that I'd purchased with money from the sale of half my tool collection to serious collectors who appreciated their historical value. The decision to leave Melissa hadn't been dramatic or angry. It had been quiet, methodical, and surprisingly peaceful. After 38 years of trying to force a square peg into a round hole, I'd simply stopped trying. The divorce papers had been signed 6 weeks ago. Melissa kept the house and most of our joint assets. I kept my car, my remaining tools, and something far more valuable, my dignity. My phone buzzed with a text message from Robert Chen. "Arthur, the Pebble Beach Concourse Committee approved our application. Your Eldorado will be featured in the prototype class next month. This is quite an honor." I smiled, remembering how Melissa used to roll her eyes whenever I mentioned car shows. "Just a bunch of old men pretending their toys are important," she'd say. Now my toy would be displayed at one of the most prestigious automotive events in the world, recognized for its historical significance by people who understood such things. The doorbell rang and I opened it to find Tommy Ricci holding a large manila envelope. "Arthur," he said with a grin, "you're going to want to see this." Inside the envelope were photographs from a classic car auction held the previous weekend in Arizona. One of the other prototype Eldorados, car number 8, according to Robert Chen's numbering system, had sold for $425,000. "Yours is in better condition than that one," Tommy said, settling into the comfortable chair I'd placed in the garage for visitors. "With the documentation you have, the maintenance records your father kept, the provenance. If you ever wanted to sell, you could probably get close to $500,000. I set the photographs aside and ran my hand along the Cadillac's fender. "I'll never sell her." "I didn't think you would. But it's nice to know what she's worth, isn't it?" It was nice, but not for the reasons people might expect. The money wasn't what mattered. It was the validation. For years I'd been told that my interests were worthless, that my knowledge was irrelevant, that my passions were silly hobbies that didn't matter. Now I had proof that I'd been right all along. Tommy pulled out his phone and showed me pictures from a classic car meet he'd attended the previous weekend. "There's a group of us getting together next Saturday at the Peterson Museum in LA. 5 of the 12 prototype owners will be there. Robert really wants you to come." I'd been to more car events in the past 3 months than in the previous 10 years combined. It wasn't just about the cars. It was about the community. These people listened when I spoke. They asked thoughtful questions about my father's work, about restoration techniques, about the technical differences between prototype and production models. They treated me like an expert because it turned out I was one. "I'll be there," I said. "I'm planning to drive the Cadillac down. She needs a good long road trip." After Tommy left, I spent the afternoon in my garage, not working on anything in particular, just enjoying the peace of my new space. Everything here was mine, chosen by me, arranged by me, maintained by me. No one questioned my decisions or criticized my methods. No one made me feel guilty for spending time on things I loved. The phone rang around 4 o'clock. Michael's name appeared on the caller ID. "Dad, how are you settling in?" "Fine, son. The house is perfect for my needs. I drove by yesterday. The garage looks bigger than your old one." "It is. Big enough for the Cadillac and a proper workshop area." There was a pause. Michael had been calling every few weeks since the divorce was finalized, awkward conversations where he tried to maintain some connection while avoiding the uncomfortable truths about why I'd left. "Dad, I wanted you to know that Jennifer and I have been talking. About the tools we sold, about not listening to you. We want to make things right. How do you plan to do that?" "We found some of your grandfather's tools at estate sales. Not the exact ones, but similar pieces from the same era. And we located the antique dealer who bought your tool chest. He still has it, and he's willing to sell it back. I appreciated the effort, but they still didn't understand." "Michael, it's not about the tools themselves. It's about what they represented. The connection to my father and grandfather, the respect for craftsmanship, the value of maintaining things rather than discarding them." "I know. I think I'm starting to understand that now." "Are you? Or are you just trying to ease your guilt?" The question hung between us like a bridge that neither of us was sure we wanted to cross. "Dad, what can I do? What do any of us need to do to earn your forgiveness?" I walked over to the workbench where I'd organized my remaining tools, the ones that hadn't been sold, plus several new pieces I'd acquired from collectors who appreciated their significance. Each tool had its place, its purpose, its story. "Michael, forgiveness isn't something you earn by grand gestures or expensive purchases. It's something that develops over time through consistent respect and understanding. I want to try, if you'll let me." I thought about the lonely dinners in my new house. the quiet evenings with no family around, the grandchildren I rarely saw anymore. The independence I'd gained had come at a cost, and some days that cost felt heavier than others. "All right," I said finally. "But this time, we do things differently. If you want to rebuild our relationship, you start by listening. Really listening. Not just waiting for your turn to talk. I can do that. Can you? Can you sit in my garage for an hour while I explain the difference between a 1967 Eldorado and a '68? Can you look at my tools and ask about their history instead of calculating their resale value? Can you treat me like I have knowledge worth learning instead of problems worth solving?" "Yes, I want to learn, Dad. I want to understand what's important to you." After we hung up, I sat in my garage as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, creating patterns of light and shadow on the concrete floor. The silence was complete except for the distant sound of traffic and the ticking of the old electric clock I'd hung on the wall. For the first time in years, I felt truly content. Not happy in the giddy, excited way of someone who'd won a prize, but content in the deep, settled way of someone who'd finally found their proper place in the world. My phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Martinez at the Automotive Heritage Foundation. "Arthur, the board approved your proposal. We'd love to have you as a consulting curator for our prototype vehicle collection. When can you start?" I smiled and typed back, "How about Monday?" The consulting position would pay well, but more importantly, it would give me purpose. I'd be working with people who valued my expertise, documenting the history of significant vehicles, helping preserve automotive heritage for future generations. It was exactly the kind of work my father would have been proud to see me doing. As the sun began to set, I started the Cadillac's engine and backed her out of the garage. The 428 cubic inch V8 rumbled to life with the deep, satisfied sound of properly maintained machinery. I drove slowly through my new neighborhood, windows down, feeling the smooth power that my father and his colleagues had built into this remarkable machine. At a red light, a young man in the car next to me rolled down his window and called out, "Beautiful car, sir. What year is it?" 1967, I replied. "One of only 12 ever built like this." His eyes widened with interest. "Really? That's incredible. I'd love to hear more about it sometime." "Well, stop by my garage any Saturday morning," I said, handing him one of the business cards I had printed for my consulting work. "I'll be happy to tell you the whole story." As I drove home, I realized that this was what I'd been searching for all along. Not just people who would listen to me, but people who wanted to listen. People who saw value in knowledge and respected the time it took to develop expertise. I pulled back into my garage and sat for a moment with the engine running, savoring the sound and feeling of the car around me. Tomorrow, I would drive to Los Angeles for the car meet. Next week, I would start my new job at the Heritage Foundation. Next month, the Cadillac would be displayed at Pebble Beach, appreciated by thousands of people who understood automotive history. But tonight, I was simply a 70-year-old man sitting in his garage with his father's car, finally at peace with the choices he'd made. I turned off the engine and sat in the sudden quiet, surrounded by tools that belonged to me, in a space that was truly mine, with a future that I would define on my own terms. For the first time in decades, I wasn't waiting for someone else's approval or permission. I was free.